Welcome inside this special edition of the Fast Lane Trail here with you. I'm joined by Greg Madia from the Daily Progress. He covers UVA, and we're going to preview the Cavaliers. Greg, how are you doing? Are you excited for football season?
Yeah, Trey, happy to join you, and definitely, it's the off season feels so long, especially as you get into August and it gets closer. You just want to start seeing some games. So glad the college football season is here.
He's got great content about previewing the game on his website with the Daily Progress at Greg Madia on Twitter. So let's dive right into it. And kind of a weird end of the year last year for UVA. You have the loss to Virginia Tech in a not normal way, we'll put it that way, and then the sudden kind of shocking retirement of Bronco Mendenhall. How did that, how shocking was it for the team? Was it kind of just like how were they able to kind of react to it?
Yeah, it was. It was an interesting time that month or so. And then at the end of it, right, Bronco was supposed to kind of ride off into the sunset with one last game in the Fenway Bowl. That scrapped because of COVID. So it was a weird little time of transition, but a good time of transition, I think, for Virginia because you look at how that season ended and it wasn't great. Four straight losses, and there's kind of a little bit of a down feeling within the program that a season that started with a little bit of hope, right? They were six. They had won. They were 6-2, had won four in a row, and kind of in the thick of it in the ACC, in the Coastal Division at least. And even though they had lost games to BYU and to Notre Dame, they were non-conference games. So going to the last 2 weeks of the year, there was still a lot in front of them. They played what was a de facto Coastal Division championship game against Pittsburgh, right? That week before the Virginia Tech game, and that didn't go well. So missed out on that chance. And then they lost, obviously, in kind of heartbreaking fashion, a little bit of a head scratcher, too, with the play call at the end of the game to the Hokies, and the Hokies won a rivalry game. So it's a really tough way to end the season. And then, December rolls around and Bronco Mendenhall decides to step down. It was definitely shocking. Not a lot of people thought it was coming as the Cavaliers, it was something where the administration probably would have liked them to stay at that point. Of course, the team had their issues defensively, and maybe some changes would have come on that side of the ball. But overall, the program wasn't in a good place, and Mendenhall had done a nice job building the program up from what it was when he took over and left BYU to come to Charlottesville. So kind of really fascinating, interesting time where he just decided to enough was enough. And he couldn't do the job to the fullest extent that he felt was needed to thrive and survive at Virginia. So then they make the change, hire Tony Elliott. And I think the one really good thing that kind of gets lost because that Fenway Bowl game was scrapped was during those practices, UVA practice for the game. Bronco Mendenhall and Tony Elliott were able to work together and kind of trade ideas, and Mendenhall was able to introduce him into the program. And I think that was really key. A lot of the players have commented about that and how that time, seeing the transition and the principles kind of aligned between Mendenhall and Elliott, even though they're very different people, you could see that some of the foundations the program was built on was going to be the same.
Yeah, obviously hire Tony Elliott, which is kind of, I don't want to call it a flashy hire, but this is a national championship offensive coordinator who's coordinated, Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, the list goes on of talent that he's had in his offensive system. I know it's not going to be as talented of a roster he has with Clemson, but what has he brought kind of that's been different to Bronco over the spring and obviously, recently with fall camp? What would be the differences you would say?
Yeah, I think schematically it's the running game, right? I mean, Virginia was air raid with Robert and I the last couple of years, the former offensive coordinator under Mendenhall, who's now at Syracuse. To me, I think it's the running game. Tony Elliott and his offensive coordinator, Des Kitchings, who was the running backs coach for the Falcons last year. They was on staff at NC State for a very long time before that. I think a stop at South Carolina as well. They've decided, that they're going to run the football for as much talent as Virginia has at quarterback with Brennan Armstrong back, and that was a huge win to bring him back for Tony Elliott. That was a huge win for him. I think you look at that running game, and they're going to try to complement what Armstrong and those, that really good group of receivers, Dontavian Wicks, Keaton Thompson. They're going to try to complement the passing game with the running game. It's an element of the offense Virginia didn't have last year, and they feel a couple of different things will help because of that, right? It'll help out Armstrong, take some pressure off his shoulders, that he has to kind of make a play on every play. He said that it was a lot of that last year, especially toward the end of the season. And then with the defense that's trying to turn it around, right? They gave up 466 yards per game last year. The defense, there's a little bit of a thought that if you can get the running game going, maybe you can help keep that defense off the field as they try to implement, a new scheme, new philosophies with a new defensive coordinator and John Rodzinski, and kind of alleviate some of that pressure they felt last year when they're going, the offense is going 3 and out at times, and the defense is right back on the field. So I think that run game should help, twofold: help with Armstrong, take some pressure off him, and alleviate some of the constant need to stop people for the defense.
Yeah, let's dive into the quarterback. 4,500 yards, basically 4,449 yards, 31 touchdowns, 10 picks, a 75.4. So he was fourth in the nation in passing yards, and he missed, part of the BYU game, I believe the entire Notre Dame game.
Correct.
So, this guy could have easily had a 5,000-yard season because this was the number 2 passing attack in the country last season. How big is it? You sort of touched on it there, that UVA is getting, one of the best quarterbacks in the conference back.
Yeah, I think it was huge. I think it was Elliott's first win as coach at Virginia, right? There were some transfers, right, particularly on the offensive line for Virginia. And there was a feel, Armstrong with a new coach and and some new surroundings, may look elsewhere, could look to go to the NFL early, but that was not the case. Armstrong wanted to stay at UVA, and he got along with Elliott right out of the gate. It was one of Elliott's first priorities was to keep Armstrong on board, and I think on top of all the talent you get, you also get probably the most respected player in that locker room back, which has helped Elliott kind of establish some of the principles, some of the cultures that he's wanted to put in place at UVA. For me, I think about Armstrong, and then his receivers followed, right? They stayed put. Keaton Thompson, Tavian Wicks, Lavelle Davis is returning from injury. Billy Kemp stayed put. All those guys stayed in place because they were going to do what their quarterback did, right? If he was going to go, they might go. If he was going to stay, though, they were all going to be on board. So I think that's a positive development. And, that group kind of makes up some of the nucleus of what this Virginia team is. Of course, they have some leaders on defense with Nick Jackson and Aaron Famui. But to me, when you have your quarterback on board, that kind of helps everything else fall into place.
Moving to that receiving core, probably the quarterback, the passing game is going to be the strength of this offense. Despite what implemented, and you touched on it, Dontavian Wicks, Billy Kemp, Keaton Thompson, Lavelle Davis. How deep is this receiving core, and how can it stack up in the ACC? Obviously, Clemson is known for having great wide receivers. I think, you look at Josh Jones at UNC. This is a premier kind of receiving core in the conference.
You can't double up anybody, right? I mean, that's the thing for opposing defenses. You put 2 players on Dontavian Wicks, and all of a sudden, then you're stuck in single coverage versus Keaton Thompson or Billy Kemp, and those guys can make you pay. I think those top 4 receivers they have are as good as any top 4 probably in college football, maybe outside of Ohio State, right? Ohio State's got a really good receiving core, but to me, they probably are a little thin behind those 4. Malachi Fields, somebody in the spring who you thought might contribute a little bit. He's been banged up with a foot injury. Then you talk about behind those guys, Devin Chandler, a transfer from Wisconsin, still kind of getting acclimated to Virginia. Maybe he'll help in the special teams realm. And then Demeek Starling, who's got really good speed, but you just haven't seen him put it all together in practice. To me, it's kind of those 4, and then Virginia's got some things to figure out in case there's an injury or 2, right? But as long as those 4 are healthy, it's hard to see them ever coming off the field with what Virginia's going to do offensively. So I think those starters are as good as it gets. Depth-wise, there are probably some things to be figured out.
Let's move to the running backs before I get to the struggles of the offensive line, or what could be the struggles of the
Yeah.
offensive line. The running game, obviously, you lose your leading rusher in Wayne Papa. I try my best with his name, but who are you expecting to kind of step up in the running game, and what kind of impact can they have? Because this is obviously, as you mentioned, they want to run the football, which is kind of something UVA hasn't really wanted to do since, I guess, Bryce Perkins was the quarterback.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. This was one of the premier competitions to watch throughout training camp, and very surprisingly, Paris Jones won the job. Fifth-year senior, former walk-on, was moved to defensive back out of necessity last year. It's a great story, phenomenal story. But he won the first team running back job, put together a solid camp. He's on full scholarship now. Put together a really solid camp, was the most consistent player, beat out Mike Hollins for the job, who's run the ball a little bit throughout his career at UVA and had some important carries. He beat out Cody Brown, a Miami transfer, and then Xavier Brown, a freshman. Ronnie Walker, who you're probably familiar with, he got hurt in the spring and is on the mend, right? They're expecting him back mid-September, late September. So I think he'll factor in once he's healthy because he was having a really strong spring until his injury. I think until that point, though, Paris Jones will be the top guy. They'll use Hollins. I think Hollins is probably the number 2 back as the season begins. But Paris Jones is the player, and I don't know if they're necessarily going to feature him on an every down basis. He's the starter, but I expect him to have an impact and be given a number of touches. They want opposing defenses to respect the running game, and by doing that, not only do you have to move the football, you have to run the ball, right? You have to call run plays for that to happen and for defenses to at least feel the threat that you can run the football. So I think you'll see a good bit of Paris Jones, some of Mike Hollins, and then beyond that, it's we'll see what happens beyond those two and until Walker gets healthy.
Well, in order to throw the ball and run the ball, you need a block. And that is the biggest issue for this
Yeah.
offense. And it's not even close. I mean, you lose your best offensive lineman to Michigan, left tackle, right tackle, left guard, also all in the portal and gone. How big of an issue is this offensive line going to be for UVA? And how concerned are the coaching staff about it?
It's a concern. I think it's a concern for sure. You're putting 5 new starters together. And what does an offensive line typically need to be very good? It needs chemistry and it needs experience. And those are 2 elements that Virginia frankly just doesn't have. Now, I don't think they're necessarily going to be bad, right? I don't think it's talking to a few of the offensive linemen, there's a feeling that, just because they're young doesn't mean they can't be good or can't have strong moments. They're not mutually exclusive things. As one, I think Derek Devine put it to me, who's probably going to start at guard for them. I think there are going to be some growing pains. Of course, they're probably going to start a freshman at left tackle with the injury to Jonathan Leach. Jonathan Leach got banged up at the end of training camp. His hand was in a cast, and I think he's going to miss probably the first week or two. So they'll probably play Mikhail Boley, a freshman, at left tackle, which is incredible, right? You don't really see that too often in college football. Right tackle is the blind side at UVA because Brennan Armstrong is left-handed, of course, and Logan Taylor will probably play there. The center job was won by Ty Farnish, and then the other guard position will probably be played by John Paul Flores, who does have experience, a transfer from Dartmouth. That experience, albeit at the FCS level, but started 20 games for Dartmouth, part of a pretty good program up there in the Ivy League. So it's going to be a work in progress. I think there are some things they can do to help that O-line out. First of all, it's Brennan Armstrong's experience. He's going to know when he has to get rid of the football. And then when you talk about the running game, I think it can actually help them by going forward a little bit, right? In that air raid offense last year, they were pretty much pass blocking the whole game, and defenses knew they could pin their ears back. I think a little bit of balance could help, right? Defensive ends, defensive tackles, they just can't fly up the field trying to sack Brennan Armstrong. They're going to have to play against the run too. And I think offensive lineman going forward is probably a little bit easier than sitting back on your heels.
Yeah, that is a really good point about this offensive line, which is kind of the biggest question mark on this offense. You know what the receivers are. You know they're going to try to run the ball, so you know that you expect production out of the running game. But this offensive line and their development is kind of going to be the make it or break it point for this offense.
If they get adequate offensive line play, they'll probably be a pretty good team, right? The offensive line just can't be disastrous, right? They have enough on the outside, and I'm sure there are things they're doing scheme wise to kind of try to counter whatever flaws they've noticed in practice and they pick up on that could be problematic for them. I'm sure there are things they can do to hide it, but you just can't have bad offensive line play. That doesn't win you games in college football.
Well, if the skill position on offense is the good, the offensive line is the bad. Let's get to the ugly. The defense last season. Um, it was one of the worst in program history, ranked 121st in the nation last season. And I mean, it just gave up yards and yards and yards last season. How big of a challenge is it for this new staff to just find any sort of improvement on this defense?
I think they're going to be better. I think they're going to be improved. You can't get much worse. I think there's been a huge emphasis, first of all, philosophy wise, on fundamentals and scheme. All right. It's been 100% all about fundamentals in practice. The scheme, John Radzinski, he was able, the new defensive coordinator who came in from Air Force, and his defenses there were known for being very fundamentally sound and very disciplined when it comes to the scheme. He had said they installed quite a bit between the spring and August training camp, but he was going to pare it down for Saturdays. He was going to make sure that he figured out whatever they could do really, really fast and really, really easily. That was what they were going to do defensively come Saturdays this fall. So I think that's a really good starting point from a defense maybe last year that got a little bit complex. I think that is a fair way to put it. And then with the personnel, I think this is probably the most noticeable changes defensive line wise with the personnel. They have depth now. I mean, they did a really good job in a transfer portal with defensive line depth. They went out and added Cam Butler, a three-time All-MAC player at Miami of Ohio. He's going to start at defensive end for them. Michigan State transfer Jack Camper is going to play at either defensive end or kind of what they're calling a bandit position, hybrid outside linebacker, defensive end type spot. And then they've added Devontae Davis, too, a defensive tackle transfer from South Carolina. And then Paula Clary, another Ivy League kid from Columbia. He's joining them, and he'll be on that defensive line as well. And that's in addition to a couple players they feel pretty good about who were still in the program. Ben Smiley, the third at defensive tackle. Aaron Famui, who I mentioned earlier. And then, Chico Bennett is who I was missing there. I think he's going to play a big role for them, probably going to start at the defensive end spot opposite of Butler. So to me, I think they're much more improved on the defensive front, which should help them, especially against opposing running games.
Do you think that's I don't want to say the make it or break it point, or just the position in which the coaching staff is looking at, like, hey, if this defensive line gets shored up, our defense is gonna be kind of adequate? Because I think the expectations for the defense, at least in terms of what they need from them, is not much, because the offense will be able to score with the talent they have.
I think that the defensive line is going to be an absolute strength for them. I think it's going to help them big time defensively because you look at and kind of just hearing from players, defensive backs are saying because of what that defensive line can do and how many guys they can roll in and out, and then get after the quarterback. There's going to be some opportunities for the defensive backs to maybe make some easy interceptions because of the pressure they anticipate the defensive line putting on opposing quarterbacks. They're anticipating some quick, badly made decisions of throws and into the breadbasket, right for interception. So to me, I think that defensive line is certainly going to be a huge bonus, huge plus for UVA this year. They're pretty stout at linebacker. Nick Jackson led the ACC in tackles last year. Josh Ahern is going to start next to him. Beyond those two, Hunter Stewart may see some action. The secondary, I think, is a little thin behind their top line starters. So that could be an issue down the road if injury occurs. But to me, I think the defensive line, the way they went about upgrading, and right, you think about where Tony Elliott came from at Clemson. What did they have there? Maybe more than anybody else.
Great.
Defensive linemen,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
I mean,
in
look at
addition to
Clemson
the
this
running
year.
backs
Look
and the
at Clemson this
receivers,
year.
yeah, and on defense, that was their position of strength. And he's made sure he's upgraded UVA to be in a place where they can roll guys in and out. And I think that's only positive.
You touched on Nick Jackson, probably the leader of this defense. How
Yeah.
important is he going to be with implementing this new scheme throughout the season? And how much you talked about the starting linebackers? Is there depth there, or are they going to just kind of hope that the linebackers can stay healthy and help with the improvement of the defensive line?
Yeah, I think first of all, to answer your first question, Trey, with in regard to Nick Jackson, I mean he's the guy that makes it go, right? I mean he's the one responsible for knowing where everybody lines up, making the calls, making the checks. He's as important to the defense as Brennan Armstrong is to the offense. I think that's fair to say, right? I think that's probably a fair point for him. He's and I think he's going to have a good year. Maybe not as many tackles because I think they're probably a little better suited to make more plays outside of one player. So I think Nick Jackson will have a great year though. And then as far as the depth at linebacker, yeah, I think they're okay there. I just think because Nick Jackson and Josh Ahern have separated from the group. I mean, Nick Jackson is an all league type of player. Josh Ahern's done enough to separate from the rest of the position group. I just think you're going to see those two on the field a lot more than you'll see anybody else. And that's why I said Hunter Stewart is probably the other guy that maybe gets some reps. Behind them, I think Deshaun Perry could be a guy to watch. He's a special teams guy, going to be on all the different special teams for UVA to start the year. But he's certainly someone to watch. And then in the secondary, I think that's more where you have your depth issues. Safety, corner. Anthony Johnson is probably one of the better corners in the ACC coming into the year. Fentrell Cypress will start at the other cornerback spot. But beyond those two, they're still trying to figure out who they can trust in that second and third team type roles. And when you're in a quarterback league, right? The ACC is a quarterback league this year. Tyler Van Dyke at Miami, Malik Cunningham at Louisville. The list kind of goes on and on. You better be able to stop the passing game and cover some receivers. So I think they're still trying to figure that out. The same thing goes for the safety position. Still trying to figure out their second and third guys.
How big of a hole is Joey Blunt? Like, how big of a hole did that guy leave? You talked about, the thinness of the secondary. It probably starts with the hole that guy left in. I believe he was at least a 3-year starter for UVA. How big of a hole does that guy leave?
Yeah, I think he leaves a pretty big one there. A couple of safeties had graduated right from last year's team, Devontae Cross and Nick Grant as well. So it'll be a pretty new looking secondary. All things considered. Antonio Clary, who played some last year, he'll probably play some safety. Langston Long is a young guy, but he's going to start for them. They've got 3 different safety positions. I think it'll be Clary at the strong safety spot. Long at the boundary safety position, and then Darius Bratton, who's played some corner, played some safety, he'll be at the free safety position. So I think it'll be a different looking secondary, and certainly, they're going to have to go prove it on the field.
What about corner? You touched on a couple starters. You touched on how they're enjoying the new defensive line upgrades, but what expectations? Because they gave up, a lot of passing yards last season as well. A lot of big plays too. So what is their expectations this season, and how can they, prevent the big play? Because it felt like, any UVA game, especially, I think the BYU game kind of emphasizes this. Like, it felt like shootouts every week for the Cavaliers.
Yeah, I think the defensive coordinator Rodzinski and then the secondary coach Jerome Cox, they're kind of cross training. Or they're both coaching cornerbacks and safeties. And there's been a lot of emphasis on fundamentals. I mean, I'm not just talking tackling, right? They do a tackling circuit every single day because missed tackles are a huge problem for that defense. But they're also working fundamentals hardcore in the individual periods. And I think there's a sense that they've simplified some things for Virginia's defensive backs, corners, particularly safeties too. And that maybe they'll hold up better. And they're also banking on the fact that They just spent, all of August and they spent all of the spring going up against Keaton Thompson, Dontavian Wicks, and all those guys on offense who are pretty good players, right? And if you can hold your own against those players, you probably can hold up against anybody in the league too. So I think there's that feeling. But like I said, the depth to me is a little bit more concerning. Beyond Anthony Johnson and Fentrell Cypress, I, I don't know exactly who you feel good about back there. Elijah Gaines is a young player. Maybe he plays some. So I don't know. I think the depth is more the concern there.
Well, that is the entire team. Let's move to the schedule and the win total, which is at 7.5. If you've listened to the Fast Lane, you go back to the Fast Lane Red Lane podcast feed. Ed and I are not as high on the Cavaliers. We think the under of 7.5 is a hit. But if you look at the highlights of the schedule, I think Richmond to kick off the year, an FCS opponent, which has gone in to Scott Stadium and actually beaten the Cavaliers not that recently. I was still in college then, but that still has happened. But should be a winnable game, and then at Illinois could be difficult, and ODU, and then you have ACC play, and then an interesting game. I think the most interesting game this season, depending on these two teams, is they host Coastal Carolina the week before Tech, and I think that is a game they could slip up at just because Coastal has been a really good Sun Belt team. They have one of the premier quarterbacks in the country in Grayson McCall, and their offense is turning out yards. We'll see what happens there. What is your expectations for this team? Do you think they could get to 8 wins, or do you think that maybe the guys in Vegas are anticipating too much? They read, oh, Brennan Armstrong's back, and not really, into the weeds necessarily on this structure of this team and what they really lost last year.
I think 7-8 wins is probably about right. I think they probably, could win more if everything goes right, and could lose more, right, if everything goes wrong. If that offensive line doesn't quite work out. But to me, when I look at the schedule and just going through it, there aren't any games on there that today you're sitting and saying that's a loss, right? There are no games on that schedule where you're just chalking it up as a loss. You think Virginia is going to be competitive and in every game every week this year. And I think for Tony Elliott, that's a good position to be in going into the year, because if you get some momentum and things start going right, why can't you win the Coastal Division? There's no juggernaut, right? If the division's proven anything, it's that anybody can win the division.
So last year, the Coastal, you have to have chaos. I said 3-3. We need like a 4-way tie or whatever, 4-4, whatever the record is. Like, that's how the Coastal needs to go out.
Yeah, but I mean, even last year, right? The Pitt won the division and then won the ACC championship game by beating Wake. Like, Virginia was in that game with them at Heinz Field. That game was a close game until the fourth quarter when I think Pitt outscored UVA 17-7 for like the last 2 minutes of the third quarter into the fourth quarter. That was a shootout. Maybe with an improved defense, Pitt's a little different, right? No Kenny Pickett, no Jordan Addison. They return their whole offensive line and whole defense, but they lose some marquee stars. New offensive coordinator there too. Miami's got changes. There are 4 new coaches in the Coastal Division, right? Brent Pry at Tech and then Mario Cristobal at Miami, Mike Elko at Duke. Right? There are a lot of unknowns going into the year throughout the division. I just, to me, when you look at UVA's schedule, you just can't mark any losses. There are probably some you can mark as wins. But I think, for me, that Illinois game will be interesting. You'll find out if they can tackle or not, with Illinois returning Chase Brown and 1,000-yard rusher. Syracuse is interesting, having to face Robert and I and Jason Beck, pretty early, former UVA assistants. And then, that ACC schedule is tough. The Pitt game, the Virginia Tech game. But nothing on that schedule says to me they'll definitely lose that game. So I think they'll be competitive week after week. And that gives you a chance to get to 8-9 wins.
That is a really good point to think about it. I think if you look at, I guess, your 3 presumed favorites in the Coastal, if you want to call them that, Miami, North Carolina, and Pitt, all at home for UVA, which is a big thing, kind of an underrated part of this schedule. Well, Greg, I want to thank you so much for joining me. How can listeners, UVA fans, connect with you online and read your content and get ready for the season?
Hey, you can find all the stuff, dailyprogress.com, and you can find me on Twitter at Greg Madia. Pretty easy.
Well, Greg, thanks so much for joining me previewing the UVA Cavaliers. As always, you can connect with me at Trey Lyle VT, at Fastlane Ed Lane, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All these previews will be on our Fastlane with Ed Lane podcast feed, SoundCloud, or the YouTube page. Thank you so much for listening to this special edition of the Fastlane.